Growing up in southern Alberta, the mountains have always been a place to run off to on a bright summer weekend. Whether it be an early morning hike or watching the sunset reflect off the beautiful Arctic rocky lakes, I am one of many generations of people able to let go of my regularly scheduled life and enjoy the peace and knowledge that the Rockies had to offer. That's one of the reasons why I joined this podcast, to learn more about these same knowledge systems and deliver it right to your ears. I'm Gabrielle Pyska, and you're listening to the Canadian Mountain Podcast. In this episode, we'll talk about the beautiful Canadian landscapes we've come to appreciate and why protecting them is so important. Specifically, I will be bringing in two guests to discuss their expertise on Canada's Indigenous, Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs, and why conserving these landscapes are vital to the people of Canada. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to appreciate the land that we work on and the people we work with. The Canadian Mountain Podcast acknowledges that our conversations engage with diverse knowledge holders who live and work on unceded land and treaties 1 to 11 of Indigenous peoples. We also recognize the historical and ongoing oppression that many different cultures, lands, and nations have continuously faced within Canada. We hope to continue our work to help decolonize, change, and inspire media platforms to further collaborate with Indigenous peoples through storytelling and partnerships. Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs, are pieces of land and water where Indigenous governments are at the forefront of protecting and conserving the ecosystems within this area. IPCAs are centered around culture, language, and the dedication to conserve these areas for future generations. These areas play a major role in biodiversity conservation and the protection of cultural heritage. In 2015, Canada made a report on the Biodiversity Goals and Targets for Canada, stating that by 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial areas would be protected. However, only 12.5% of Canada's terrestrial areas are in protected areas as of the end of 2020. This is why, in this episode of the Canadian Mountain Podcast, we will be discussing the importance of IPCAs in Canada and other places in the world, and what listeners like yourself can do to support further creations of IPCAs in the future. Our first guest, joining us from British Columbia, is Dr. Courtney Mason, a professor in rural livelihoods and sustainable communities at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops. He's also the principal investigator for a research project surrounding Indigenous land rights in Canada and New Zealand with the Canadian Mountain Network.
Okay, White Pesquas, Shego, Bienvenue. Hello, nice to be here for the podcast. My name is Courtney Mason. I'm a professor and Canada Research Chair at Thompson Rivers University, part of Kamloops at Secwepemc and part of Secwepemcúlecw, the traditional territory of Secwepemc peoples.
Also from British Columbia is our second guest, Eli Enns, an internationally recognized expert in biocultural heritage conservation and Indigenous economic development. Eli is also the co-founder of the Hoekman Tribal Park in Clayoquot Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island.
Hi, my name's Eli Enns. I'm from Clayoquot on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and I'm calling in from the Saanich territory, just outside of Victoria, BC.
I met up virtually with both Eli and Courtney to discuss IPCAs in Canada and New Zealand and why creating these protected and conserved areas are so important to the diversities within Canada.
Perfect. So, in your own words, do you think you could both give me a brief description of what an IPCA is or a tribal park and why they're kind of really important?
Tribal park is a modern day application of traditional governance values and principles in a modern day context of ideally in ethical space where we're bringing together the best of Indigenous knowledge systems and the best of Western science. So the heart and soul of a tribal park or IPCA is language and culture, but it is also an exercise of Section 35 jurisdiction. The Canada Act of 1982, Section 35, recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, and an IPCA is an exercise of jurisdiction through Section 35. So it's kind of founded on language and culture. It's an act of Indigenous law, and then Indigenous law bridges into Canadian law through the Constitution, through Section 35 of the Canada Act of 1982. And also, an IPCA is a bioregional economic development model. So you're looking at, watershed features and looking at various needs, integrated human infrastructure and natural infrastructure, and how do you meet the needs of society while fostering and cultivating more abundance in the environment. So that's a little bit of a run-on sentence, but there's just, for me, a few dimensions of what an IPCA is.
Just to build on that, the second part of your questions was sort of related to the significance or importance of it, and I think it's particularly important in these new land use models when you consider the history of parks and protected areas in this country. They, as you both know, were used as basically tools that facilitated the displacement of Indigenous peoples, and in many cases, a great deal of least case scenario, denying access to ancestral lands, but in many cases facilitated cultural loss and cultural repression. So these types of new models of looking at land use and Indigenous-led land use are significant, particularly in that historical context in this country and many settler colonial nations.
Now, Eli, this question is for you. You co-founded the Haukman Tribal Park in 2007. Can you maybe tell me a little bit more about what the role looked like for you?
Yeah, well, I was, at that time, I was directly employed by my First Nation, Clayoquot First Nation, and I was the project coordinator for the Tyastanis Equilibrium Community Project. And so this was an addition to reserve initiative where we were repatriating land from the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. So Courtney talked about how historically parks were, unilaterally placed into our territories without our consent and often to the detriment of our communities. And that was the case with the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And so in repatriating this land, one of my roles was to engage with elders and knowledge holders to advise on how to go about community development. And one of the things they said to me, the elders in particularly, they said, Hishuk ish Sawak. Hishuk ish Sawak in our language means everything is one and everything is interconnected. And so they couldn't just talk to me about that particular piece of land without talking about the interconnection with the rest of the Hahufi, our traditional territory, so to speak. And so emerging out of that community engagement process, what became the Haukman Tribal Park, which is the larger ecosystem that impacts what's happening at Tyastanis. And so this is where I was kind of educated in Hishikish Tawak and a tandem approach of community health and well-being interconnected with ecosystem health and well-being. And it is also worth noting that at that time, our nation was growing fatigued by the BC comprehensive land claims process. The bad faith negotiation tactics of the provincial government of the day, stalling and liquidating resources at different tables, and just using the so-called modern day treaty process as another instrument of divide and conquer. And our nation had grown fatigued by this while we were busy negotiating here and continuously running into roadblocks of bad faith. And so we decided to just do it. We just said, heck with this process. We're just going to declare another tribal park, because we declared our first one in 1984. And the court, coming out of the Mears Island court case, instructed us, the province and the nation, to go away from their chambers and negotiate in good faith. And we never got good faith for decades. We got shenanigans. And, there was a lot of good work done. Don't get me wrong. There was a lot of good, passionate work by our community members. And so, yeah, but you know what? We brought together a diversity of stakeholders that normally the province does not consult with. That they just go ahead with a particular idea of economic development based on big boom, big bust economy strategy, get rich quick, not thinking long-term sustainable growth. And so we brought together stakeholders from a variety of backgrounds. We invited everyone and anyone who wanted to participate to come in, 100% transparency. And for me, this was exercising basic good governance. And we partnered up with non-Indigenous partners. Contrary to popular belief, tribal parks wasn't about getting rid of all of the newcomers. It was about working with those newcomers that shared our vision for long-term sustainability and long-term abundance. So we built, since then, we have a very strong clean energy sector in that tribal park. We've got a flourishing ecotourism sector. And yes, we do want to have value-added small-scale timber activities for local job creation, not to satisfy the insatiable foreign markets, but to focus on job creation right here at home for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I don't think that's too unreasonable.
Now, for you, Courtney, you were the main investigator for the project that focused on the IPCAs in Canada and New Zealand. Do you mind telling us a little bit what a role like that entailed?
Yeah, just a point of clarification. The sort of main focus was not on IPCAs in this project.
Okay.
It's we basically wanted to look at several designations of parks and look at the diverse ways that local Indigenous communities were asserting rights, and try and understand if that designation in itself creates different types of facilitators or barriers for those rights. And so in that project, there were sort of three co-applicants in three communities that we worked with, and one of them is in the context of Banff with Nakota peoples at Morley. And, as we know, Banff is in the federal system. It's the oldest, some would say most conservative, most set in its ways type of park that also probably has the most stakeholders in the context of tourism development, billions invested in tourism development in a town site. And then we originally, when we submitted this application, it was looking at the Mackenzie Bison Sanctuary in the Northwest Territories, which part of which became Edeshe, that Canada's first IPCA, and during this time frame. The other one is based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's how parks are, the new designations of parks there around the concept of personhood status or personality status. And we basically looked at these sites. They were chosen based on the different designations, but they're also chosen on long-standing relationships in these three places, in particular in Fort Providence in the Northwest Territories, where I've been working for about 12 years now, in the context of Banff about almost 20 years, and then in New Zealand since 2009. So we kind of had these great collaborations in place, but we weren't working really together. and sharing different ideas and about kind of tracing both the historical development of these designations, but also how Indigenous peoples are asserting rights in those spaces, in a contemporary context.
Now, Courtney, the next question is for you as well. I'm wondering if you could break down a little bit what your project with the IPCAs in Canada and New Zealand looked like, and kind of what the project process was itself. I know that you mentioned that a little bit, but if you'd go into a little bit more into detail.
Sure. Yeah. Basically, we have these three co-applicants, longstanding colleagues and friends, and we wanted to really just examine why a designation in these spaces matters. And one of the interesting, aspects of that, we knew that there was all kinds of progress, all kinds of strategic or successful ways that communities were navigating these systems. In some cases, to pursue very similar types of goals, but we know that there are legal kinds of constraints to those systems and those designations, and we wanted to see how even despite those constraints, communities were maneuvering within them. So that was really the goal of the project. When you look at a place like Banff, you can imagine how difficult it is when you compare it to, say, the rural north of Canada, or even rural North Island, Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we had these collaborations in place, but really, we wanted to trace that and gain communities' perspectives about, particularly in the latter two of those sites in the Northwest Territories, very dynamic park context, being the first IPCA, and then in the case of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where you have these precedent-setting designations that there are a lot of objectives around both rural Indigenous livelihoods, but also conservation principles, and how does the legal status and management of those spaces matter, and I think that's some of the key questions that we're looking to address in that project.
And what would you say some of the main findings have been, or findings that maybe particularly stood out for you?
Regarding preliminary finding is, there are a lot of similarities despite these incredible differences within these designations, that local peoples, the way that the reasoning behind their wanting access to their ancestral lands remain the same. The reasons and objectives that they have, whether it be to foster cultural return in some cases, like in the case of Banff, to these places, or to invest in Indigenous perspectives of governance or conservation models. We found a lot of similarities with the objectives that local communities have in their vision for the use of ancestral lands. And that doesn't necessarily surprise us. We know that Pacific peoples, I would imagine there are a great deal of similarities to what's happening on the West Coast with Aotearoa, New Zealand. Lots of long, established network in Pacific peoples, but we weren't sure about the North and in a place like Banff, but what we're finding is some interesting progress and interesting sort of challenges and barriers that communities are facing from their perspectives.
Now, Courtney, I know you mentioned that there were some of the similarities that you noted. What were also some of the differences that you maybe found between Canada and New Zealand's process?
One of the primary differences is this really innovative approach that New Zealand is applying. Remains to be seen how effective, this personhood status or personality status. I'm not sure if I should go into. Some listeners will be very familiar with that, but others maybe not. Basically, it's the idea of attaining a legal status as a person, and applying that to ecological features or resources. So this began with in 2014 with Uruwera, which was a formal national park. For the most part of its history, co-managed in the last 4 or 5 decades of the 20th century by local Tuhoe or Maori peoples and the federal government. And that was returned to Tuhoe peoples in 2014 for them to generate their own management structure. And part of that was this legal designation. That was followed up by the Whanganui River in the North Island gaining that status. Two other federal parks then gained that status with Tongariro, which is the Lord of the Rings kind of landscape that you see, or Canadians might be familiar with, and Edgemont National Park near Taranaki. And so you have this sort of wave, not unlike Canada, this wave of new designation taking hold, and communities are finding this process, for lack of a better term, a way of, to use Eli's expression, to deal with fatigue in court systems, long-standing, decades-long, in some cases many decades-long fatigue in a federal court system, and also, and shenanigans, to how communities could exercise these rights. And they look for new strategies, and this seems to be one that's working for many Maori communities.
Now, Eli, I know at the beginning you did mention part of the main reasons why the tribal parks came to be here in BC. What did the process of co-founding the Hakuin Park look like?
1984, the Mears Island Tribal Park was declared by Clayoquot and Ahousaht with the support of the hippies and the other non-Indigenous peoples that stood with us at that time on the peaceful blockade. And, Moses and others educated me, and they said that they were not being civil disobedient. They were being obedient to natural law, and they're being obedient to New Chamath law. So the act of declaring that it happens in a moment, the act of self-determination, and to articulate like what Moses did in November of 1984, when the loggers arrived at the shores of Sisyphus, which they call Heelboom Bay. Moses and company had prepared a welcoming meal to welcome the loggers and have a meal with them. Ha'uk Hahopa. Ha'uk is the feast, and Hahopa is to share knowledge and teachings. And that's what he intended to do, because when he first learned about Macmillan Bloedel's plans to log Mears Island, he did an Usink ceremony, which is a traditional cold water submersion exercise, and to seek guidance from Isak, teaching the principle of respect on what to do. And from that ceremony, he realized that what he needed to do was to meet those people, those human beings on the land, and to share a meal with them, and to try to educate them about the land. And so when they arrived, he welcomed them ashore. And he said, I would like you to join us for a meal, but you have to leave your chainsaws in the boat. This is not a tree farm. This is Wanaja Hilfus. This is our garden. This is a tribal park. And what Moses was attempting to do was to create cross-cultural literacy. And what he was doing was exercising New Chamath law. And that was our declaration. It doesn't have to be a proposal to the government or on a big piece of paper in the computer forms and such. That's their way of doing things. Our way is through ceremony, and through exercising relationship, and through oral declaration, oral testimony, and also through our crest and that Isak crest was put at the cabin at Heelboom Bay, which is the sun or the moon crest. So to answer your question more concisely, Gabrielle, how that happened was through an act of self-determination, but not through aggressively asserting a right, per se, but through exercising our responsibilities.
Now, Courtney, this question's for you, but honestly, I think both of you could kind of put your input into this. How do you both feel that Canada has fared in creating and managing IPCAs in comparison to other places in the world?
Right. Well, because the actual idea of the IPCA or the name of it isn't really applied in the Aotearoa New Zealand kind of context. It's quite a different model, but I think that probably one of the other places where at least they're using the same terminology and some of the same concepts is Australia, and despite in a settler colonial historical context being one of the most culturally repressive of settler colonial places, the IPCA model, the way it's being applied there, the feedback that I'm getting from community members anyways is really positive. So I know a little bit more about how places are legally, applying personhood status. For example, in Ecuador or India or these sort of things in the context of Indigenous communities. But I still point to New Zealand being the leading the way in that discussion. Partly because I think the Maori communities and the ways that they're applying those legal concepts have more teeth in Aotearoa New Zealand than they do in some other places in the world. So that's my take, a little more of an international take, but Eli, probably there's been lots of dialogue. I would imagine you could speak to between, especially Australia and Canada, and maybe other places.
Yeah, I've got to say that in 2014, the World Parks Congress was hosted in Australia. And in advance of that Congress, we held a meeting in the Blue Mountains. And we heard directly from Indigenous nations in Australia. And I have to say, like what Courtney's saying here, like when I first saw the PowerPoint presentation, I was blown away. Like I saw these huge native title lands. They call them native title lands. And then these huge IPAs, Indigenous Protected Areas. And I was like, oh my God, here I thought Australia was one of the most repressive, like oppressive nations to Aborigines. And this is what I had kind of got the vibe and what I had heard from many people. To see all these native title lands and all these IPAs, I was just really impressed. And so we had a little workshop breakout session, and I was saying this to the people in my group, and I was just blown away. I feel there's so much hope. Like, wow, this is incredible. Native title lands and IPAs, wow. And then right away, this elderly Aboriginal guy, he's like, wow, don't believe everything you see. And right away, he launched into how this was government smoke and mirrors, that an IPA doesn't have even the teeth to stop a mine. In fact, mining goes hand in hand with IPA strategies. Choose what part of your land are you willing to sacrifice, and what part of your land do you want to keep nice. This is the enforced land use planning process. And while we were there at the Congress, the government of Western Australia unilaterally shut down 100 Aborigine communities. Get the people off the land, get access to the land. That was the start. That was the start of 2014. I sat with Patrick Dodson, the winner of the Victoria Peace Prize and one of the founders of the Kimberley Land Council. I sat with him and his lawyers over dinner while I was there. And I asked him point blank, I said, I'm getting all these mixed messages. It looks like Australia is so good for people. Then they're telling me, no, it's a wolf in sheep's skin. No offense to wolves. And I asked him, I said, point blank, the lawyer sitting there, does this IPA have any jurisdictional teeth? He says, no, it cannot stop a mining development. In fact, it often goes hand in hand with mining development. And you know what? If the nation wants to do mining, and that's their self-determination, then who am I to tell them how to live? But if they're doing it with a gun to their head, then I don't think that's ethical. So I don't know about the IPA model. And then it works for some people there. One of the guardians I spoke to there, she heard me asking these questions, and she kind of took me aside and she says, it's not perfect, but it's better than what we were getting before. And that broke my heart.
I have a couple more questions for you. The first being, I know we discussed it at the beginning there a little bit, but the Clayoquot Sound movement in the 1980s and the 90s, all over the web, it's considered one of the biggest acts of civil disobedience in Canadian history. But I know that you mentioned it's less of a civil disobedience and more of an obedience to natural law. Do you feel that big movements such as the one that happened in Clayoquot Sound, those movements are what's going to cause more movement in creating IPCAs and stuff? Like, do you think that we need more people to get on movements such as the one that happened with Clayoquot Sound in order to create more change?
Yeah, and I would say all of those Canadian citizens that bravely and happily got themselves arrested, they believe themselves to be exercising civil disobedience. I wouldn't want to take that away from them because through the social contract that they are part of with Canadian social contract, they were disobeying civil law. I think that the era of mass civil disobedience is not over. Obviously, with Fairy Creek, we see this happening. But I think what will actually be the next biggest wave is the love and forgiveness and a revolution of cooperation that is starting to happen. I had the benefit of knowing William Commanda before he passed away. My uncle Moses Martin, who just turned 80 years old a couple days ago, the elders from Treaty 7 who smoked the peace pipe at the IPCA National Gathering in Canmore, Alberta, and at the various elders across this country. I believe that we are living amongst Nelson Mandelas. I see these elders who have lived through the harshest eras of policy in this country and who still have love and forgiveness in their hearts, that are still willing to share their teachings, that the sacrifice that Nelson Mandela made for his society and for freedom of Black people all over the world. We have those people, those great leaders right here, and they're often overlooked.
Yeah, just see your last question, Gabrielle, is mostly answered from Eli, really, about kind of like what are the ways to get involved and how to learn and what are other responsibilities. It reminds me of the South Island Maori Ngatahu concept of topuni, which is that the chief has that cloak of values that he places over a certain landscape, and I think Europeans interpreted that as asserting rights to that landscape. But really, it was more about what Eli's talking about is what responsibilities do local peoples have to the ecosystems that they're inherently part of and contribute to, but exist within. And I think that has a lot of resonance looking out the window here, where I'm looking at the smokes, literally smoldering fires here in Kamloops. The last week, I know that other parts of the province are experiencing that as well. And so how could we not, recognize that the ways that we try to manage lands have not worked very well, and that potentially asserting more responsibility, more older, more connected ways of knowing about lands. How could that benefit all of society? And I think getting to the point of how do you learn from this? And I think we're doing that a little bit here, having these conversations. There's been a lot of dialogue, of course, around residential schools here in Kamloops. These are not new ideas for Indigenous communities across the country, but I think that they had a lot of resonance with the greater non-Indigenous Canadian society, and I think these are touch points. These are pivotal moments to enter into a dialogue, whether it could foster a lot of learning, whether it's at literally on the land learning with elders in education institutions across the country, lots of social media, podcasts. There's lots of avenues for that. But I think that this is a really important time to rethink, our relationships with ecosystems. The start of the British Columbia fires season, and the end of COVID. If we're not, if those aren't kind of red flags for us, then I'm not so sure we have potential of recognizing, where we're headed. If these sort of huge impacts that impact all of us aren't front and center in our dialogue, our day-to-day quotidian type of conversations. So I welcome those. It's great to be part of them, and this is also a benefit of being part of a larger network like this. CMN is a ton of learning opportunities that could facilitate for all kinds of levels of learners within the network and those that we reach out to. So I also appreciate your time and thanks for organizing.
Canada is a mosaic to a certain degree, but in a way it's been a melting pot as well. And therefore we have a lot of people who don't know who they are. They don't even know what the word Canada means. Canadians who call themselves Canadians, they don't know what the word Canada means. They don't know that it is a Haudenosaunee word, or the history of this country and how it was won in war by the Haudenosaunee Confederation. In the 7 Years' War, in the War of 1812, in every world war, Indigenous warriors voluntarily went to war. My nation, we're celebrating 210-year anniversary this year, 2021, of the successful attack on the Tonquin, which was an American ship that was owned by John Jacob Astor, the Pacific Fur Company. And that ended a 20-year conflict between the newly formed United States of America and Nuu-chah-nulth peoples that started with the American attack on our village of Opitsat in 1792. They bombed and burned our village to the ground, and it was undefended. 200 longhouses were there. It was a monumental 10,000-year-old village site. A lot of history was lost when they burned that to the ground. But our Nuu-chah-nulth peoples took the Boston and the Tonquin, and I believe, and if you know your history, those were the years leading up to the War of 1812. And those were pivotal acts of resistance to American expansionism, and that has maintained the 49th parallel. So I encourage everyone to get to know themselves, who they are, where they come from, their own culture and values. So many young Canadians, they take up yoga, which, don't get me wrong, I think it's great, but it comes from someone else's culture. They take up everything, fashion themselves with everyone else's culture, but who are they? And that, I feel, is an insatiable desire. When you don't have that knowledge of who you are, there's a whole, anyways, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on this too much, but the point is we could all do a lot better if we had those things, because in all of our elder societies, there's simple but powerful teachings on how to live in a better way with each other and with the land. And then also get to know where you are. The land acknowledgement is a great thing, and let's go a little bit deeper. I'm not going to criticize the land acknowledgement. Many people do. I'm going to say, yes, that's a good first start. Now let's dig a little bit deeper. Where are you? And I think once we know who we are and we know where we are, then we can have a conversation about where we're going.
That was Courtney Mason and Eli Enns, two experts on the topic of IPCAs within Canada and other places around the world. The two hope to continue providing both Western and Indigenous ways of understanding these protected areas, and why having them are important to both our biodiversity and our cultural heritage. That's it for this edition of the Canadian Mountain Podcast, in partnership with Mount Royal University. Thanks for listening. This podcast was produced from Treaty 7 territories, of which is immersed in ancient culture and storytelling. With the Canadian Mountain Podcast, our goal is to share both Western and Indigenous ways of storytelling, and we give appreciation to the stories that have been told on this land and shared through generations. For this reason, we give acknowledgement to the hereditary keepers of these lands, the Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, Stoney Nakoda, Tsuut'ina, and Métis nations. I'm Gabrielle Pyska, and special thanks to show producer Ethan Ward. Be sure to join us again for more stories surrounding mountain places, whether that be from around the country or in our own backyard. Share and subscribe to get the latest updates on the new seasons, and be sure to tell your mountain-loving friends and colleagues. You can find us wherever you podcast, and you can learn more about the Canadian Mountain Network at canadianmountainnetwork.ca.